Okay, so our agenda for today, we're going to get started with Dr. Shireen Khosropur, who is the Department Chair for Interdisciplinary Studies, and she's going to talk to us a little bit about the International Day of Peace. And then I'll be speaking a bit about our Mexican American Studies program at Austin Community College and the other events in the series. And then I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Gary Moreno, who is a professor of history and Mexican American history, and also the director of our El Centro at ACC. And he will be introducing Dr. Paul Ortiz for us. So without further ado, Dr. Khosropur.
Hi, everyone. Thank you and welcome to the launching event of the Latinx Heritage Series. My name is Shireen Khosropur. I'm a psychology professor at ACC, and I'm the department chair for interdisciplinary studies and director of the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies. And this event, I'm delighted to say, is a shared event co-sponsored by the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies, Interdisciplinary Studies, and El Centro. A little bit about our program in Peace and Conflict Studies and International Day of Peace. Our program, Peace and Conflict Studies, is in the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies, and students can get an Associate of Arts degree in Peace and Conflict Studies. The main pillars of the Peace Studies program are human rights and social justice, and conflict studies and peace processes. According to a dominant model of peace studies, the three major areas of strategic peace building are: one, regarding violent conflict, is working to prevent, respond to, and transform conflict so it's productive, not harmful, working to promote justice and healing, and working to promote structural and institutional change. The model puts at the center of all these components one common factor, and that is humans and their relationships. The science of peace studies shows building healthy relationships and communities, both locally and globally, are the essential elements of any movement toward peace. Because the mission of our work here at Austin Community College is education, we focus on these principles within the educational framework. So what does that look like? Duncan Morrow, who is a professor at Ulster University in Northern Ireland, said, "As educators, our task is not to defeat our opponent. The task is to bring in a new world, to create safety because we know we belong to each other in a deep sense. And if we're not committed to the relationship, then we will come across as simply being the kind of people who want to win and people who see facts as what can help me win or cause me to lose." He cautions against replacing relationships with knowledge and using that knowledge as a weapon. So any educational model for peace must include at its core a focus on social justice and a focus on human relationships. So in that spirit, we're thrilled to be working across departments and centers at Austin Community College, and also with our distinguished speaker, Dr. Paul Ortiz, who is generously and willingly and enthusiastically donating his time to us, and more specifically to you, our dear students, because you really do deserve the best. And so I would like to thank my colleague, Dr. Lydia Sarabaca Cruz, for organizing this event, and I turn it over to her.
Thank you so much. That's wonderful. So I am privileged to serve as the program coordinator for the Mexican American Studies program at Austin Community College, which is also in the Interdisciplinary Studies department. Like peace and conflict studies, there's a lot of overlap, right? Also, human relations and community relations and social justice are also at the heart of Mexican American studies. And like peace and conflict studies, students can also pursue a degree, an Associate of Arts degree in Mexican American studies. So I wanted to share our webpage where you can get a little bit more information. So I'll put that in the chat. If you're interested in the talk today, or in the other events in this series that we will be having throughout this Latinx Heritage Month. You can feel free to check the website. My contact information is there. You can also contact me, and I would be more than happy to talk to you about what additional courses we have, how you can use a Mexican American Studies degree. Mexican American Studies from its founding has always been academic pursuit from the people, for the community. And from raza for raza. And so if that's something that interests you, please feel free to reach out to me. Also, as Dr. Kozrapor mentioned, this is our kickoff event in an entire month of celebrations of Latinx excellence, and coalition building, and really working to forge partnerships across community lines, to build coalitions and to really merge the community and show the community the role that ACC plays, and really to show that ACC is a community college, right? And we're here for the community. So it's been a pleasure to work with Dr. Kozrapor out of the Interdisciplinary Studies department, as well as Dr. Gary Moreno, to develop a whole event series. And you can find out more about that event series in the schedule that I just dropped in the chat. Our next event will be a panel of musicians, miércoles de músicos, músicas. It'll be a brown bag lonche event next Wednesday. So we hope to see you at some of these other events that we'll be having as well. And really throughout all of these events, you can get to know more about the Mexican American Studies program, as well as El Centro. And I will now turn it over to Dr. Gary Moreno, who is director of El Centro, and I'll go ahead and drop the link for that into the chat as well. Gary?
Thank you, Lydia. I'm just going to go ahead and begin with the introduction for Dr. Paul Ortiz. Dr. Paul Ortiz is a professor of history and director of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program at the University of Florida. He is president of the United Faculty of Florida UF, an AFL-CIO union that represents tenured and non-tenured faculty. He, in 2013, received the Cesar Chavez Action and Commitment Award for outstanding leadership through engaging in activities which dignify workers and by making notable contributions to the labor movement and demonstrating resilience in organizing workers, especially those who have been traditionally disadvantaged. Some of this was for his work in organizing grape pickers for the UFW in Washington. Dr. Ortiz received his PhD in history from Duke University in the year 2000. All the more remarkable because he is a first-generation college graduate. He is also a third-generation military veteran. While in the military, he was in the 82nd Airborne Division and the 7th Special Forces Group in Central America in the 80s, I believe. And due to his meritorious actions in the wake of the eruption of a volcano in Colombia, he received the U.S. Armed Forces Humanitarian Service Medal in 1985. Dr. Ortiz has several publications under his belt and in the works. He writes about colonialism, African-American history, Latino, Latinx history, labor history, and social movements. In 2018, his 2018 publication, An African-American and Latinx History of the United States, received the Penn Oakland Josephine Miles Award for Literary Excellence. And he also appeared as a consultant and a featured narrator on The Black Church, This Is Our Story, This Is Our Song, with Henry Louis Gates Jr., which premiered on PBS in 2021. I want to welcome Dr. Ortiz on behalf of El Centro, the Latin American Studies Center, Mexican American Studies and Mexican American Studies at Austin Community College. We are very happy to host Dr. Ortiz as a featured speaker for our Hispanic Heritage Month celebration. And I want to extend a personal thanks to Dr. Ortiz as a fellow historian for taking the time and effort to read and dissect the writings of John Quincy Adams concerning Latin America. This is the nitty-gritty of historical work. You know, people don't do that kind of stuff. And so my hat's off to you, Dr. Ortiz, for doing that kind of hard historical work. And welcome to our Hispanic Heritage Month celebrations.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Moreno, for a very kind introduction. Thank you, dear colleagues. It's been so wonderful over the past month getting to know many of you and getting to know more about your college. As Dr. Moreno noted, I'm a first-generation college student and a very proud community college graduate myself. I graduated from Olympic Community College in Bremerton, Washington in 1988. And it was an incredible experience. I'm still in close contact with a lot of my fellow students, from Olympic College. In fact, I'm in greater contact with those students in many cases than I am with any other students in any other cohort I've been a part of. So I'm also, over the past month, I've just become a big fan of your college's Peace and Conflict Studies program and Mexican American Studies, because both of those, and I think we heard in the introductions, personify what I think we need to be doing as a society in terms of studying, where we've come from, what our contributions are, what we need to really work on. We're really at a crisis moment in our society. And this issue of endless war, this issue of imperialism, of violence in our communities and how that's connected to the violence that the United States demonstrates outside of the US are really big issues. And I want to talk tonight about, the main topic of Hispanic Heritage Month and the themes that have been mentioned. But I also want to kind of preface it by again asking us to think about the timeliness of peace and conflict studies and Mexican American studies in this moment that we're currently in. And we are in a situation where the majority of the citizenry in the United States really wanted the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq to end much earlier than it turns out they're going to be ending, hopefully, right? For years and years, every time you took a poll of American citizens, and this is interesting because as Dr. Moreno noted, I'm a third generation military veteran. I mean, every male member of my family up to my generation, every one of them has been in the military going back to the Mexican Revolution, and then our family fled during the revolution. Some of my grandfather's brothers served in World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam. I was in Central America. My brother-in-law just retired from the Navy, did 2 tours in Iraq, working in the Green Zone. And so even amongst those populations, when we sit down as veterans, we say things like, what are we doing? What is this country doing with all of these bases overseas? And see, this is where peace and conflict studies and Mexican American studies have so much to teach us. Mexican American studies, because Mexico is a country, for all of its paradoxes and flaws and strengths, and every country has paradoxes, right? Mexico has developed a culture, a series of legal and constitutional traditions that have prevented it from invading, from occupying, from being part of imperial projects throughout the world in very important ways. There's a tradition of non-interventionism in Mexican constitutional history that a lot of US Americans need to be studying. If we're trying to figure out how to get out of this loop of endless wars, what I'm suggesting here is let's use Hispanic Heritage Month to study the histories of anti-imperialism in countries like Mexico, in other Latin American and African and global South countries, histories of anti-colonialism, histories of nonviolence. So these are things I think we really need to try to understand and to learn. And they are big issues in Hispanic Heritage Month events all across the country. So this year I've been busier than ever. And in terms of the theme of intersectionality, I really do think that the Black Lives Matter movement has really ramped up this passion among people from all walks of life. Asian American communities, Puerto Rican communities, Dominican communities, African and Haitian communities. The Black Lives Matter movement has really pushed us as a broader nation to take a much harder look at our histories at our shared histories, at the problems we've had, certainly racism, but also anti-racism. And a lot of people ask me to comment about, anti-Black racism in Latino communities. And in fact, I've done a lot of presentations in the past few years on the invitation of Latino community organizations to talk about this issue of anti-Black racism within our communities. But one of the things I always point out is, yeah, it's a problem. Anti-Black racism is a big problem in Latino communities. It was when I was growing up. But we also have these strong traditions of anti-racism that we need to understand and learn from. Every major nation, or actually every nation in Latin America, has a tradition of has a literary anti-racist tradition, along with a political tradition. And so those are things we need to kind of learn from as well. I want to talk a little bit about kind of where I came from and why I ended up writing this book, An African-American and Latinx History of the United States. And I want to share with you some stories out of that book that kind of highlight this theme of pride, intersectionality, and the struggle for democracy in Hispanic Heritage Month. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm a first-generation college student. A lot of this book really came out of, three sources, really. One was my own military background, going to Central America as a very young man, being in special forces, and I was all over Central America in the mid-1980s. It was really, in terms of peace and conflict, wow, we could have used some understanding of nonviolence. This is kind of embarrassing for me to admit, but I never even heard the term nonviolence where I grew up. No one ever mentioned that term. I grew up towards the tail end of the Vietnam War era. I'm just old enough to remember a lot of the young people coming home in quote unquote body bags. Those were older brothers of my best friends. Those were fathers. Those were people on my block. There was a time as a kid, I thought going to a funeral every week was just something, that's just, a normal thing. It's not normal. And so I guess what I'm trying to share with you is that that's the kind of culture I grew up with, very much a war culture. And we were constantly either in Cold War and hot wars. And the only thing different about my generation was when I turned 18 and got ready to graduate from high school, I realized at a certain point I would be going out, I was going to be sent off to Central America, for my term, as it were. Now, why was that? Why couldn't my community, why couldn't I have had other ideas, other aspirations? Why did I have to wait to read Martin Luther King Jr. until after I got out of the Army? That's a really odd kind of thing. Why couldn't I have been introduced to it? And why couldn't so many of our youth today be introduced to these ideas before they make that decision to go into the military? And so again, I'm so excited to look at your curriculum at Austin Community College, because you're giving younger, middle-aged, older students opportunities to learn that we didn't have in my generation. If there was an anti-war movement in my town growing up in Bremerton, it would have been the bravest people on the face of the planet, because like I said, everyone I knew was involved in the military. So the other tier, the other kind of foundation of an African-American and Latinx history of the United States is my students. And interacting with students who are so hungry for knowledge about their own communities, a lot of times I just tell them, look, as an oral historian, the first thing that you should do is grab a recorder or a notebook and a pencil and interview your elders. Start there. Learn about their life histories and kind of build on that. The books are great, but start close to home, because a lot of the people who have sustained our communities in the context of what we're supposed to be celebrating in Hispanic Heritage Month, many of those people never even had the opportunity to go to school. My father jokes with his brothers all the time. They had this little ritual when they talk to each other on the phone. They grew up in Houston in the 4th and 5th wards. And if you're familiar with Houston, you know what that means. They have a joke, a standing joke, and one of them will say, "Hey, Pablo, what year did you graduate from high school?" And my dad's like, "Man, you know I didn't graduate from high school. I went to 7th grade, just like you did, sucker." And they kind of, you hear these elders banter back and forth because that was their reality. The reality of my father's generation was you left school at the 7th grade. And it was just so automatic. I'm not even sure to this day how it worked. Did you show up for class the first day of 8th grade as a Mexican-American boy and they told you, "Hey, you're not supposed to be here, man. You're supposed to be working, as a busboy or something." But that's just the way it was. So again, this is why community colleges are such a blessing to this country. And we have to do everything we can to defend them and to expand them. So the desire of my students to learn their histories and to learn about their contributions, to learn about their struggles and their challenges, where they came from, was really vital in the making of this book. And then the third thing, as Dr. Moreno can tell you, is really addressing the scholarship. And I've been so lucky in my life to be able to look up to people who I've known or just read and been able to draw from their incredible wisdom. People like Vicky Ruiz, who is the first Latina president of the American Historical Association, people like Rudy Acuna, who has published 9 different editions of Occupied America, and really has stood up for the extension of Chicano studies throughout the country. People, I'm thinking of people who were involved in the Chicano blowouts in East Los Angeles in 1968, who then matriculated to colleges. Some of them became founders of ethnic studies programs or public-facing programs at community colleges or high schools or universities or community centers or unions. This is one of the things that I was really taught by my mentors, some of the people that I mentioned, is they've said, "Paul, when you're doing ethnic studies, whether it's Chicano studies, Black studies, Raza studies, Asian, whatever, you're only doing half of your job if you're only teaching on campus. If you're not working in the community, and that could be in a prison, it could be in a union hall, it could be in a community center, it could be in a women's health clinic. If you're not out there, then you're not really fulfilling the traditions that we set up for you younger folks." Now, the elders I'm talking about, again, are people like Angela Davis, people like Pat Savea, who recently retired from UC Santa Cruz. They made it very clear to us younger faculty members as we matriculated through graduate school in the 90s, being ethnic studies means getting out there, connecting your campus to the community, reminding your students that we learn as much or more from the community as they learn from us, and the learning needs to be really reciprocal. So let me go into a shared screen mode here, and I want to share with you some of the things I'm really excited to talk about for Hispanic Heritage Month. And like I said, this has just been incredibly active, another very active year. This is about I think my 7th or 8th presentation for Hispanic Heritage Month. I hate to say it, but I couldn't do this if I was having to travel. But Zoom allows us to, be one day in Miami, the next day in Chicago, the next day in Austin. I think tomorrow I'm actually going to be back up in New York. And so it's important for us to understand, again, I think of my students, how much we have contributed to this country. I'm not going to read all these slides. I'm just going to kind of present them to you. But this is kind of, if you ask me of 2 individuals who I think personify the spirit of this month, these are 2 of the individuals, certainly. And they're individuals who we've had to struggle, as your faculty can tell you, to not only get them in the history books, but to keep them there. And this is going to be a struggle for the rest of our careers, I believe, is that when you look at the contributions and the politics, and again, there's no coincidence here, many of these Latino Chicano, Mexican American, all of the above freedom fighters were also either pacifists, they were anti-imperialists, many were, oh my gosh, socialists. Wow, you know, and so they were characters who were out of the mainstream, and they personified these, in this case, Mexican, Latin American ideas of mutual aid and solidarity. And but in many ways, we're going to have to struggle to keep them in the books to make sure, because when our students learn about who these individuals and the movements they were part of were, they get so inspired. They're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe they did all these things. We think it's hard now, but think of what they had to go through. So this is just a little bit about my background, growing up in the military, going to Central America in the mid 80s was such a wake-up call for me. And it was the most important experience for me, formative to becoming a scholar, because I would talk to people in Latin America and they would be like, well, what are you doing here? Like, what does the US hope to accomplish here? And because I worked on my own a lot or in very small groups, I had opportunities that people in larger like compounds would never have had. Like I could just talk to someone, you know, who had a shoe shine stand, or someone who was running a bodega, or someone, you know, or even a young Honduran NCO, you know, at the border between Honduras and Nicaragua. And just, we could kind of shoot the breeze, right, as we say. And we'd start talking. And I remember a lot of conversations would be like, wow, you know, what is up with the US, man? You guys just can't seem to be satisfied. You're always tinkering in other people's business. And remember, the people I'm talking to, they were not like, you know, they weren't Marxist guerrillas. They were people, quote unquote, on our side in most cases. And so I learned to question, and going to Central America was so important for me. My belief now is that if you want to become an intellectual who's going to grapple with problems in your own country, you've got to do one of two things. You've got to be able to leave that country and kind of look at it from the outside in, talk to people who have been the subjects of that country's activities. Juan Gonzalez talks about the harvest of empire, right? Where you have a situation where many people come to the US after their countries have been subjected to US economic, political, military policies, right? So my belief is you either have to leave that country and kind of look at it from the outside in, or you have to be able to imagine that. If you can't physically leave it, you have to develop the capacity, we call it the historical imagination, to see what that country kind of looks like from an outside vantage point, because otherwise you're kind of stuck with American exceptionalism. You're stuck with this idea that, you know, we don't want Cesar Chavez in the textbook because he might say something that makes us feel uncomfortable. Or in Florida, we have banned critical race theory because we've had people say, oh, well, this makes me feel bad as a white person. Well, that's a tragedy. You should always be open to critique. I don't care what racial background you think that you're from. But this idea that we have people running around saying, I don't want this person in the textbook because he or she makes me feel bad, that's a problem. We got to figure out, you know, what that, you know, and again, Shereen, that's I don't have the capacity to deal with that. That's probably a psychology question, right? I love thinking about these incredible people that when we talk about intersectionality, allyship, coalition building, these are four of the most remarkable people in the history of the Americas. And again, there are many others that we can talk about. These are four individuals who play a big role in an African-American and Latinx history of the United States. But really, before I started this research, I didn't realize how they intersected, you know, how their lives touched upon each other. Two of them knew each other very closely, intimately. But then in most cases, they didn't have to physically or kind of be in contact with each other. But they were working along parallel lines and parallel struggles. And I'll kind of explain what I mean by that a bit later. one of the things I'm trying to do with an African American and Latinx history of the United States, and really with Hispanic Heritage Month and Black History Month, and in many ways now for me, those two, we used to joke in my family, my household, we don't know what's more busier for Paul. Is it Hispanic Heritage Month or is it Black History Month? Both of those months, you can't get a conversation with them. He's going to be constantly busy on the road, et cetera, et cetera. But what's fascinating to me is how those 2 months those 2 months themselves are increasingly intersected, intertwined. It's fascinating to think about also two of the apparently fastest growing holidays or celebrations in the United States now, Cinco de Mayo and Juneteenth, are also increasingly intertwined. I get a lot of requests to talk about one or the other, but most of those now are combination requests. Talk to us about, when we talk about Juneteenth, what does Latin America have to do with Juneteenth, or what does Mexico have to do with Juneteenth? And we're getting great scholarship that's helping to inform people like me be able to better answer that question. But to me, the big question in the book is, and for Hispanic Heritage Month, is how do we build democratic social movements? And my argument in the book is that we've got to look south. We have been we've been looking to Europe for a long time, but all of those centuries we were looking at Europe, in the literature that I read, and I read deeply in philosophy, in a lot of different fields, during the time that people were building freedom movements in Latin America and Africa and Asia, these were also centuries where the Europeans were building, apartheid, eugenics, social Darwinism. So why would you look just to Europe if the issue is how do we build a democratic society? That just doesn't make sense to me. And so that's one of the reasons why in the book I urge people, look to the South, talk to the people who've come from the South. When I say the South, I mean it could be Cuba, it could be Haiti, it could be any country in South America, et cetera, et cetera. Struggle is such an important part of this. We say intersectionality and the struggle for democracy. And a really important idea for me over time, working with students and working as an organizer, and Dr. Moreno noted earlier, I did start my career as a younger labor organizer with the United Farm Workers, working on the Chateau Saint Michel boycott. But this idea of struggle is very important. And especially understanding that every democratic right we enjoy is an achievement that our ancestors fought, suffered, and died for. And that's not hyperbole. That's as basic as I can make it. Because without sacrifice, people like Dolores Huerta, without the work that she's done over the years, we would be in a much worse place than we are now. But what she's had to contend with during her life, including being severely beaten by the police, is something, that's a part of our history as well. This history of fighting oppression, this history of organizing, in her case, of helping to put together a union, which still exists, but also her sense of intersectionality and saying, we start with the union, but also we're going to be working on LGBT rights. We're going to be working on civil rights. We're going to be working on Asian American rights, and so she's one of those kind of intersectional figures. I think that's very important for us to take a deep dive at. What I'm trying to understand more is what Julius Scott, one of my mentors, calls the common wind, using a metaphor from a William Wordsworth poem about Toussaint Louverture, the leader of the Haitian Revolution. How is it that oppressed people throughout the Atlantic, throughout the so-called global South, were able to communicate ideas of resistance, of struggle, of anti-colonialism, without having access to cell phones or without having access to media? And Julius, when I was in grad school, was such an exciting experience for me to be with him. if you can believe this, I was in independent study with Julius Scott, and Vince Brown was my grad school peer. And Vince now has written incredible books on slave resistance, and he's a professor at Harvard. But the three of us would just sit down, and Julius would talk about, think about a port city, think about Veracruz, think about St. Augustine, think about New York, think about Baltimore. And these were cities where working class people could spread ideas of dissent or rebellion. And Julius would say, imagine that first crew that gets off of a ship from Haiti in 1792 and starts talking to enslaved African Americans working on the pier, right? A generation later, they would have included people like Frederick Douglass. And Julius says, imagine them getting off of their ship, whether it was loaded with molasses or rope supplies or wine or whatever. Imagine them getting off the ship and saying, hey, man, our people have just revolted in Saint-Domingue and they burned the plantations down. Can you imagine what an electrifying effect that would have had in the port of Baltimore in 1792? Now, if CNN had covered the event in Haiti, they probably would have tried to get both sides and all this stuff like that. But the sailors have a very different kind of vantage point. So emancipatory internationalism is kind of this idea that I'm trying to get at. This is just the table of contents from the book. This is a book from really the 1776 to present. When I published it, present was like 2000. When I finished it, present, I think was like the day after Donald Trump was elected. So that was pretty dramatic, right? And what my argument here is that if you're going to really create a new way of understanding US American history, that's going to be much more accurate, can be much more explanatory in explaining how we got to where we are now, you've got to place the Global South at the center, the Haitian Revolution, the Mexican War of Independence, the Cuban Solidarity Movement. And it really has to be a working class history. This is what I learned from reading the works of people like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., liberation theologians. Dr. King's argument was that he was very upset when he was writing about scholars in the 60s. He said, I don't understand why they created this narrative of the US as a middle-class society. It doesn't make sense. Most people, even now, are not in the middle class. And throughout most of this country's history, you can't put enslaved people in the middle class. You can't put debt peons. You can't put sharecroppers. You can't put women in most historical periods in the middle class. Why would you create that mythology? He said the US is a working class country. And if you try to characterize this as anything other than that, then you kind of create a large number of people who are kind of dysfunctional if they can't be middle class. So I learned a lot from reading, civil rights history. The public arts traditions, and I think this is really exciting to think about during Hispanic Heritage Month, is culture. And I know with your series at Austin Community College District, art is a very important part of this. And this is something that is so exciting to think about in the traditions in Mexico and other countries. And really now I'm thinking primarily about Mexico City in the wake of the revolution and the incredible energy that went into ensuring that the history of the nation would be out of doors. And what I mean by that is we love, as faculty, we love classrooms, we love libraries, museums, but you can literally walk down any small town in Mexico or in most towns that I've been in Latin America and see the people's history presented outside on walls, murals, right? And this mural tradition was very important in trying to get people to understand, again, intersectionality. If you look at these, and I know these are very disturbing images, but when the last time my wife and I were in Mexico City, we're looking at the at both these. I just sat down before the Siqueiros mural and just sat there for hours. And these are enormous, by the way. This little slide cannot really communicate the enormity, the physical enormity, the emotional impact of seeing people enslaved, of seeing people being burned alive by European soldiers. But also the implicit in here is the resistance, is the struggle, is the endurance, is the survival. Even in the very brutal Siqueiros mural on the right, you see people looking on. They're watching their comrades being destroyed, but there's a sense that I'm going to endure, I'm going to survive, and I'm going to make it possible for the next generation to survive. That public arts tradition, by the way, was a gift. Was really what led to the WPA project in the 1930s in the United States. And the new literature, which is we're on the cusp of being published, is going to really demonstrate how much the US owes to, in this specifically Mexican cultural arts traditions. So intersectionality, how do you do it? How do you become an ally? One of the things within this history that we're studying this month and that we're paying homage to is this idea of being there for each other's struggles. Martina Espada, the great Puerto Rican poet and writer and professor of literature, UMass, for me, is one of the people who does this kind of intersectional work. And this is part of a larger poem. I won't read the whole thing, but as you go through it, and you don't need to be a poet necessarily to do this kind of work, but what the poet here is trying to get us to understand is that oppression intersects, interlinks. We used to talk about, I think back in the day, the unity of oppression, right? And this is kind of what Martina Espada is trying to get us to understand, that the connections between the Holocaust, slavery, the European conquest of the Americas, let's think about those together. Let's not separate those out. But then most importantly, when you get to the end of this particular stanza, let's understand that even the most powerful, brutal Europeans are not many-legged gods, that they too drowned and plunged in the river. And it's a wonderful poem, I think, to illustrate intersectionality. You can read it for hours and hours and hours. This is one of many stanzas. But this connection between colonialism of Africa, of Asia, of the Americas, really is highlighted in the years after World War II. This was an opportunity that was largely missed. But you had a number of the world's best philosophers and thinkers trying to understand why the Holocaust had happened, why the Nazis had come to power. And Dr. Hannah Arendt, who's one of the great philosophers of the 20th century, really kind of breaks it down here. She says, if you want to understand the origins of totalitarianism, and that's the title of the book, you've got to understand how this started with colonialism, with slavery, with imperialism, and it was a case of the chickens coming home to roost. Now that's a colloquialism. Dr. Arendt wouldn't have used the phrase. So I'm just kind of giving you a 500-page book in one sentence. What she's talking about is the chickens coming home to roost. And what she does say is that, what were Europeans thinking when they sent these administrators to Africa, to Latin America, to Asia, and they taught them and they learned ways of treating the natives as inferior? And when they went to expropriate all their goods, and when they crushed people, and when they created a eugenics hierarchy of superior and inferior, what did the Europeans think would happen eventually? What were they thinking? Because when the Nazis came to power, what they said was, look, this is what we're just using what we've learned. We're building upon European culture, European civilization. We're the master race. How can you argue against that? The British say that, the French say that, the Dutch say that, they all say that. So why would you criticize us for saying that? And this is the disturbing, troubling truths that Hannah Arendt is trying to get across in Origins of Totalitarianism. We know now that Nazi Germany learned a lot about segregation from the United States. And we know that basically racial oppression and white supremacy in this country has been aimed at multiple targets at the same time, right? This is a sign my father grew up with as a young boy in Houston, Texas. This a similar kind of sign was at the restaurant that he worked at in the back. And I asked him, how much, what it was like to have to work in a restaurant like this. He said, "Oh, son, we only saw the sign from the back because they wouldn't let us walk in the front door. So it wasn't that, it wasn't that big a deal." But, kind of imagine what it would have been like being a parent trying to raise a child during this time. I mean, as parents, one of the most important things we've got to do is to instill in our children a sense of dignity, of self-respect, right? And then you begin there, and then you talk about care for others, concern for others. But how can you do that in this kind of society and a culture which is constantly trying to poke at you, to provoke you, right? In terms of peace and conflict. And this was a tremendous challenge to try to live through. These signs, and they're terrible, they're horrific. But I do think that when we get together to talk about Hispanic Heritage Month, Black History Month, and other commemorations, it's very important to understand the difficulties that our ancestors and elders had to deal with. And this is just on the surface. This is a hateful, brutal sign, but I want us to kind of get back into a historical imagination where we think about what our great-great-grandparents or ancestors had to do to survive in this country, in this world. And keep in mind, this is in South Florida, which is supposed to be a progressive part of the South, okay? So here's another one of the people from that quiz. And Jose Marti did so much work in promoting this idea of intersectionality. And one of the things he did, and he intersects so well with Ida B. Wells, and I didn't know this until I started doing this research. Marti was writing about anti-Black lynching in Spanish for predominantly Latin American audiences. He did a lot of writing in Mexico when he was in exile from Cuba. And he was trying to do a couple of things. One is he was trying to warn people in Cuba and other parts of Latin America about the negative aspects of US culture. Because even then, the US was all over Latin America and the Caribbean trying to take things over. And Marti was kind of desperate. He's like, look, you've got to look carefully at this culture. What he does here is the same thing that Ida B. Wells does. I'm not going to read this, but what's striking to me about how Jose Marti, this great Cuban revolutionary, depicts anti-Black lynching is he's one of the few people other than Ida B. Wells who gives a voice to the victim of the lynching. In all the other cases I've looked at, if you read the New York Times, the Post during that time period, the big predominantly white newspapers, they never give you the voice of the victim. But this is something that Marti tries to do. This is a deeply cultural thing. If we had more time to talk about it, I would go more into this. But again, this is where he was writing about some of the same lynchings that Ida B. Wells wrote about. And their writings are so strikingly similar to each other, even though they're writing in different contexts and different languages. But it's just so amazing to me that there's this intersection in how they're trying to challenge oppression and discrimination. So the Haitian Revolution is really the key revolution in the age of revolutions, which lasts, roughly from the 1760s to the early 19th century. And the Haitian Revolution is so inspiring. It's the thing that helps to kick off the Mexican War of Independence, the other liberation struggles in the continent and in the Caribbean and really all throughout the world. Ultimately, it's the only successful slave revolution in human history. And most importantly, it's a revolution where the victors, the Haitians in this case, become trainers. They become military advisors. I'll kind of use that special forces language as I learned about. I mean, the more we get into the scholarship, and Julius Scott was one of the people who started this, but other people like Lauren Dubois and others have been deepening our understanding. So many of the revolutionaries from Latin America end up in Haiti. And the reason they end up in Haiti is really twofold. I mean, one is if you go to Haiti, especially in the South, you're going to be granted sanctuary, and you're going to have the chance to kind of take a deep breath. A lot of the revolutionaries who end up in Haiti from the mainland, if you will, people like Simon Bolivar, got just wiped out by the Spanish. People forget how skillful Spanish artillery and infantry was. And I have a lot of people who have the stereotype, and they're like, well, the Spanish, were very poor military. I'm like, what are you talking about, man? You really, to go against the Spanish Empire in the early 19th century was like a death sentence. I mean, I wouldn't have done it. If you'd have come up to me and I'm in a town and outside of San Luis Potosí or something, and you say, hey, Paul, you're a soldier. Let's rise up against the Spanish Empire in 1810 and declare independence. I'd be like, what are you a fool? Are you an idiot? They'll capture us and execute us, and we'll die very, very bad deaths. We're not going to die quickly, in other words. Okay, we're going to be tortured. So no thanks, but no thanks. But the Haitians defeated two French armies, one directly under the control of Napoleon. They defeated the largest military expeditionary force in history, the British expedition sent to re-enslave them. And they defeated a Spanish army as well. And so they're the ones that know how to defeat the Europeans. And this is one of the reasons why so many of our ancestors go to Haiti, either, again, physically, if they can, or imaginatively. Haiti becomes this inspiration to oppressed people. And this wonderful quote by Frederick Douglass is his last speech, y'all. It's very moving. And it comes towards the end of the 19th century. And it's in Chicago at what will become the World's Fair in later decades. But he's asking a Black audience, who do we owe our freedom to? And he gives major props to John Brown, to Thomas Clarkson, who helped end the British slave trade. These are giants of international history. These are some of the great figures of world history. When you talk about William Lloyd Garrison, when you talk about Thomas Buxton, but Douglass takes a pause and he's like, but we owe the most to the pioneer emancipator of the 19th century, Haiti. And to be a good historian, you have to understand that you're probably no smarter than the people you study a century, 2 centuries, 3 centuries earlier. People knew in 1893 to applaud, and they knew when Douglass talked about the role of Haiti in their people's freedom in Chicago, they knew he was right. And so they responded appropriately. I wonder today if people would respond the same way if someone talked about Haiti, because we've been so brainwashed to see Haiti in a different light, as impoverished, as powerless, as needing our help. But that's not the way that oppressed people saw Haiti for 2 full centuries. And certainly, this is something I became dimly aware of in Central America when I was in the mid-'80s, but not really understanding, but the incredible impact that Haiti had on the freedom struggles all throughout the hemisphere, even to the point of, in many cases, this is not the only example, but the case of the flag of Venezuela being raised first in Haiti and not in Venezuela for, again, very good reasons. If the Spanish had caught you doing this in 1806, you would have been tortured and then executed.
And Dr. Ortiz, just to let you know, there's about 5 minutes left before we open up to Q&A.
Excellent. Right on time. I appreciate that. Chapter 2, the Mexican War of Independence, so formative to the history of the United States. The Mexican War of Independence starts on a much higher plateau than the American Revolution. What I mean by this is that the more we learn about the Mexican War of Independence, the more we realize at the very outset, it's a war against slavery and it's a war against the oppression of indigenous peoples. We know now that the U.S. Congress, congressmen from the U.S. began suing Mexico for the loss of quote unquote our property. What they mean by this is that enslaved African Americans are finding sanctuary in Mexico from slavery even before Mexico gains its independence from Spain. I found this crazy correspondence in, looking at congressional records and stuff, and these congressmen from Louisiana are like, we got to sue Mexico, and other people are like, they don't even exist as a nation yet. It's really crazy. But there's an underground railroad going to Mexico that, again, new generations of scholars are telling us perhaps accepted more enslaved people for sanctuary than perhaps even Canada did. Now, this is something that kind of blew my mind because, again, in college, I didn't really know that. There's a lot of stories about the Mexican War of Independence that are just so moving and so powerful. But this idea, again, of a revolution led by Black, by African descent and indigenous descent peoples is a very important story. It's muted in Mexico, even to this day. And I know this because I work with a lot of first-gen students from Mexico, and they're like, we didn't learn this. We didn't learn the true history of our country's original revolution. What's wrong with us? I say, don't worry. The Americans don't learn their history of their revolution either. The French don't learn their history of their revolution either. There's a reason for that. There's a reason why we have to recover these fragments of resistance and struggle. And so just to kind of wrap up, this is the thing that inspired people like Frederick Douglass and Garrison and the foremost abolitionists of the United States, was the fact that even before Mexico achieves independence, it's striking out against inequality. And it's striking out, I love, one of the most remarkable lines I've ever seen in any pre-Constitution is this idea that torture shall not be permitted. Wow, my gosh, that is heavy stuff. And another heavy point in the book, people ask me, what was your favorite, most exciting piece of research? And I really think, again, kind of echoing what Dr. Moreno said earlier, looking at John Quincy Adams and some of these earlier founding fathers and finding this correspondence about Latin America, which was really, really prevalent. But most importantly, finding this correspondence from Jose Morelos to President Madison. I didn't know this existed. I'm going through this batch of letters, and I'm like, well, this is really interesting. It's in Spanish. It's apparently from Mexico. God, who wrote it? Get to the bottom. It's Jose Morelos. Are you kidding me? My gosh, one of the founders of the nation. And this is what could have been. When we think about Hispanic Heritage Month, we think about the struggles, the oppression, the resistance. But when we start thinking about the future, we can also, I think about what could have been in the past. This is such an amazing moment of possibility where Jose Morelos, one of the founders of the Mexican nation, is talking, one-on-one with James Madison. They're not in the same room, but the letter is saying, look at what we could do if we coalesce, if we formed a coalition. Peace and conflict studies again, y'all. If we came together, instead of seeing each other as antagonists, that the Europeans want what you have. The British just came and burned down your capital just a few years earlier. They came and burned it to the ground. What if we formed an alliance? There's so much that we people from Mexico can learn from you Americans. And we also believe there's a lot you can learn from us as well. We believe the learning should be reciprocal. And what would our histories have been if President Madison had responded positively to the letter instead of being advised, oh no, we need to be thinking about how much land we can gobble up in the midst of this war. That's the unfortunate outcome of this. But what could have been, I think, is very important. There's so many ways you can think about being intersectional, and there's great music now, and it's very, music is even more intersectional than it was in the 70s in some cases. But I don't want us to, again, forget about where we've come from in terms of thinking about a musician like, say, Carlos Santana, who composes this wonderful song. It's an homage to the Haitian Revolution. He's talked about it many times in his career. It just happens to be in one of the great albums in rock and roll history, which you can listen to over and over and over again. Now, of course, I'm dating myself. You're like, wow, was he in Woodstock or something? Carlos Santana was at Woodstock. I wasn't. But imagine this: a Mexican musician goes to Chicago, composes this song, performs it in a global tour. You can see on YouTube the performance in Santiago. It's so incredible. It's so incredible. It's the art forms of indigenous America, Africa, Mexican, Chicago blues, in this incredible explosive homage to the Haitian Revolution. And I think it's Carlos Santana's way of reminding us, hey, as Mexican people, as Americans, as Black people, we owe so much to the Haitian Revolution. And I'll conclude with two quick slides. One is, in African American Latinx history, I was really, again, blessed to have great mentors and people that taught me to really think outside of the box. And there's this, again, I mentioned this newer literature that those of you who teach ethnic studies know is really just amazing. And because of digitization and because of the incredible energies of our colleagues in the libraries and the archivists, we've been able to have access to Spanish, English, French, different language newspapers from the 18th and 19th century, which have unveiled new traditions of resistance, and in this case, abolitionism. And we're beginning to chart out a Mexican tradition of anti-slavery activism, which is very strong in the West, in California, especially. And people like Francisco Pedro Ramirez, we actually have, there's 2 books on him now, I believe. There's another one that's coming out. Frederick Douglass, we'll kind of conclude with Frederick Douglass. The mural here in Belfast, in Northern Ireland. Very fascinating to encounter this in Northern Ireland. The last slide I want to share with you gets back to the core of what I think Mexican American studies and peace and conflict studies are all about. Thinking about the elements or shared histories that are rooted in anti-imperialism, in anti-colonialism, in concern for each other, in emancipatory internationalism. Frederick Douglass here is asking us to understand the origins of the US Civil War, a bloody war which we really still have yet to totally recover from. And he's telling us that, and remember, this is a Northern audience he's speaking to. If you've read African American Latinx histories, I kind of set it up by saying Douglass was invited to speak before this audience in Philadelphia in the middle of the Civil War. And he was asked to give kind of a feel-good speech about how the North is fighting the good fight against the Confederacy and, got to prop people's morale up and everything. If you know anything about Frederick Douglass, he's not the person to invite to your gathering to make you feel good about yourself. He's the person who's going to come and tell you the truth. And a lot of times the truth is very hard to look at. And this is what he does here. I'm not going to read this, but you kind of get the gist. Douglass is saying, yeah, the Civil War kind of sucks, but you brought it on yourself. How did you bring it on yourself? How did you cause this horrific war to break out? Well, you invaded Mexico. You attacked Native American nations. You suppressed the freedom of speech. You attacked the abolitionists. And you did all of this to promote slavery. And you did all of this to try to make good with your cousins in the South. And oh, by the way, it was very profitable for you to do so. So now you're asking me to talk to you about the Civil War? Well, you brought it on yourself. And again, this is Douglass reminding us about why these phrases like intersectionality and anti-imperialism, peace and conflict studies are so meaningful to this day. We've got to do more than just say, oh, these were great individuals. We should remember who they were. Let's think about why it took us so long to get them in the textbooks and why we're going to have to fight to keep them there. That quote from Frederick Douglass, when I show that to people, they're just like, some people get as outraged back as they did back then. They're like, well, how could he say all these things? And I'll take time and I'll say, well, look, and because I give a lot of talks, I give talks to a range of different groups, including corporations. Tomorrow, I'm actually giving Hispanic Heritage Month talk, believe it or not, to Deutsche Bank up in Wall Street. And so I get very different types of receptions to these things. And people say, well, gosh, it sounds like Frederick Douglass is criticizing the United States. You think? Yeah, very important. So anyway, thank you for your incredible patience. I know I've been talking a long time, and I'll kind of try to zip it for a little bit here and take questions or comments as you have them. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Such an inspiring talk. We do have about 20 minutes for questions. If anybody would like to, if you have mic access, if you have audio access, you can unmute your mic and ask Dr. Ortiz a question. Or if you prefer, you can also put a question in the chat. While we're waiting, I have one question. Well, I have tons of questions for you, but I'll ask one right now. One of the things that really stood out to me and that I found to be really, really powerful in the book, An African American and Latinx History of the US, is the point that in so many of the periods of US history that have been cast as these like isolationist moments, where the US is nation building and very inward looking, you point out that African Americans in particular are really internationalist, right? That it's not isolationist at all, and to claim these moments as isolationist kind of ignores, this whole history. So that leads me to reflect on kind of our current moment, our current historical moment, and think about the narratives of isolationism that have at least been, maybe it's rhetoric, right? And I'm curious if you can speak to what is the scope of international community, or this kind of connection of international, what did you say, the unity of oppression? What does it look like today, or what does it look like in the past decade, for instance?
Well, I think that there have been efforts to knit together, communication between people from different parts of the world who have been traditionally connected by oppression, by militarism. And, I'm thinking of now, we talk about liberation theology. When I returned to the US in like 1986, the end of 1986, it was only about a year after that I actually was in a household, and we were actually harboring refugees from Central America. Now, this is really interesting in retrospect because, up in just about a year earlier, I've been involved in military actions that actually created refugees. But I didn't quite understand that until I came home, and people were asking me these questions that irritated me. One of the questions was, Paul, why are there so many Salvadorans in Los Angeles? Why are all these people from Honduras or Nicaragua ending up in Sacramento and Oakland, and all these other cities? And I would say, well, man, you don't know what your government is doing in Central America? I mean, well, they're fighting communism, Paul. And I'm like, well, I was there, and I can tell you that was really not the main thing that was going on there. But I can tell you that we made parts of the region so unlivable for people, they had to leave. And so just like the British, see, when you study the British Empire, the French Empire, everything we're talking about now is not controversial. A lot of immigrants to France come from places like Algeria or Morocco, places that France brutally suppressed, okay? The British, the same way. We talk about the Windrush generation. Immigrants from Jamaica who arrived in London shortly after World War II, and they're trying to kick them out 50 years later. I mean, isn't that something? But back in the US, and I apologize, it's kind of an elliptical response to your very direct question, we slowly began to knit together these solidarities. The sanctuary movement, I think a lot of it obviously was based upon kind of religious traditions of human solidarity, but it was just one of many different examples. And I can also remember another example. I do think I remember this correctly. I wouldn't write it down because I'm not sure, but towards the end of my military service in Central America, I remember reading this article, and it must have been, I think I was in Colombia, and there was just this piece in a Bogota newspaper, and it was talking about how a Black leader by the name of Jesse Jackson was in Mexico City to try to broker peace accords between the United States and the Sandinistas. And it just kind of blew me away, because I'm reading this piece and I'm like, how could you even do that? Like, I didn't even know such a thing was possible. And because I didn't know who Jesse Jackson was, to be honest with you, at that point. And it wasn't until I got back to the US that I learned, who he was, what he stood for, his relationship to Dr. King, to Cesar Chavez and the UFW, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess what I'm just kind of thinking out loud here to different connections that people were making in anti-war movements and religious movements. And again, I'm thinking primarily kind of north-south movements. Richard Rodriguez he's a very provocative writer. He's a very fascinating individual. His argument is that, it's really peasant workers, campesinos, agricultural workers that are the first people to really see this whole hemisphere whole. They're the ones who come with these traditions and cultures, and they get to the United States and they've got to make it work. And they're reconfiguring US culture in many, many interesting ways. To me, we got to find a way to get the foot off of the endless war pedal. And that is something, again, where I think we can learn a lot from these kind of global South traditions.
Yeah, we've got, if we could turn to the chat too, there's been a few comments. I'll scroll back through, starting with Ricardo Garcia, who I think also is in the Air Force. He says AATW, and I'm sorry that I don't know what that means.
Oh.
But Ricardo, you can jump in too if you want to clarify. Also, we have one of our fantastic deans with us, Dean Stewart, and she noted that, even though Hannah Arendt probably would not have said the chickens have come home to roost, Malcolm X did. And then there was a question too about the slaves and kind of the Underground Railroad to Mexico. I don't know if you want to speak a little bit more about that.
Well, one of the things that, and there's a lot of work to be done. I was able to look at some Mexican kind of parliamentary governmental papers or documents that were microfilmed. And I assume now, hopefully they've been digitized. I'm planning to go back to the National Archives next year and kind of pick up some of this research. But these were debates that were held, and they go back to it's interesting, they go back to talking about Jose Morelos's strategy of recruiting people for the War of Independence and the kind of pitches he made to people when he went to people who were African, we might call now African descent, or people who were indigenous peoples. And he spoke and he was multilingual. Many of the leaders of that generation were multilingual. And I think of recruitment, as a movement organizer, recruitment's got to be your number one question. But again, how do you get people to believe in themselves that they can actually defeat this powerful empire? And so those ideas of anti-slavery and also of fighting the Spanish Empire's ideas of caste. And remember, caste is not just this abstract thing. I'm not sure we understood this correctly for a long time. Now the scholarship is telling us that, your life chances were in the Spanish Empire were profoundly hinged upon how you were defined racially. And it was the priest who played such a critical role in this, in defining you racially, in part through the census, through the empire's census. And this is why Morelos and other priests become such key leaders in the early War of Independence. They're the people that break from that system, or some of them break halfway. Morelos at a certain point is just like, look, I'm just not going to put down people's racial categories. And he's beginning to get into trouble. And if the war hadn't happened, I mean, he would have been dealt with very severely. I mean, obviously he was eventually captured, tortured, and executed. But he was part of that generation of people who was beginning to fight back and refuse, and he had a certain privilege, but he used that to begin to challenge the racial categorizations. I've seen some of it in the chat, and racial classifications in the Spanish Empire were pretty dire. I mean, there used to be a time when we thought that, race was not an issue in the Spanish Empire, the Portuguese Empire. I'm just old enough to went to grad school and read some of the older literature in Brazil, for example, which said that, race was never the issue here compared to the United States, right? Well, that literature has been, but then again, and I know many of you know this, but if you look at the literary traditions of all these countries, there are literary traditions of anti-racism. There's literary traditions where people, like in Colombia, for example, has a very powerful tradition of Black writers, but also people who might identify as mixed people writing against racism, against Black and Indigenous peoples. And that literary tradition, that's outside of my kind of, discipline. But I've seen that, and people say, oh, hey, Paul, did you know? Because when I was in Colombia, and I spent a lot of time there, I met people, some of whom I'm still in contact with, and they would just send me this reference to a book. Oh, did you know about this book? It came out in 1946. It's a book about anti-Black racism in Bogota. And I'm like, wow, I didn't know about that, And so, yeah, there's a lot of this going on. This is one of the reasons, by the way, and one of the characters I forgot to talk about, Antonio Maceo, the great revolutionary general in Cuba. I didn't know this, but when I started doing the research, I mean, he was a beloved figure in Black communities all throughout the United States. And when he died, there's this huge period of mourning. I mean, hundreds of commemorations were held. Ida B. Wells Barnett spoke at some of these in Chicago. And at first I was like, well, I wonder what Black people in the United States saw in Antonio Maceo, that they adopted him as, and sometimes they'd say, our general. And they really despised the Spanish, especially when Maceo, was killed. But one of the things they often said was that Maceo is African, indigenous, or native, and European. And he doesn't try to hide any of those. And he doesn't try to pretend that being those multiple traditions just kind of makes him a mixed person. He's proud of all of those distinctive but overlapping cultural heritages. And this is why I think that people really had a lot of respect for him. And it demonstrates a much more sophisticated idea about race in the United States than I thought had existed. Because again, you hear about the one drop rule and things like that. But the reality is that people viewed race, even in the United States, in a much more complex manner than just the one drop rule.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Do we have any other questions? Oh yeah, and Ricardo clarified AATW, airborne all the way, 173rd.
Oh yeah, okay, all right. All right. Well, thank you for your service, sir. And yeah, we knew a lot of people in the 173rd when I was growing up on my block, although most of my neighbors, Bremerton is a Navy town and a Marine town. So there were Army folks as well.
Yes, Stuart mentions the Costa paintings. I was just thinking of those as well.
Incredible. And again, you could look at those for hours. I remember, Stuart, you may remember, I don't know, but I was, when was this? It was shortly after I moved out to California, and the Los Angeles Museum of Art had that incredible Costa, display or exhibit. It was so moving. I remember I was just in tears. I mean, the totality of this just hit you. I mean, I'd seen those before as plates in books and in museums, but very partial, never, all in one place, just really overwhelming. They blow my students' minds, by the way. And when you get into the captions and the definitions, they're like, what the heck? I'm like, yeah. Well, this is an aspect of colonialism.
Definitely, especially with so many of the terms coming from that being so dehumanizing that they come from the names of animals, lobos and mulattos and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I connect that, Lydia. You're right. I mean, I connected to the some of the Jim Crow signage, that places Black people and Mexican people at the level of animals,
right.
So yeah.
What other questions do we have? We still have a few more minutes.
I have a quick comment here. Paul, recently I had a strange encounter. I ordered a Lyft and my driver was a flat earther. I've never been around a flat earther, so I was curious. I listened to him talk. And it was quite interesting what he told me. I had no idea that this thing was so complicated. He told me that, besides the flat earth thing, that he believed that 200 years ago, there was a civilization on the planet called Tartarians. And these Tartarians were wiped out, right? By a great mud flood is what he said. And he would totally believe this, right? And he said that now the reason that we fight wars is because we're trying to hide the remnants of Tartarian civilization. So this to me seemed like, I don't know, like something out of Star Wars or the Marvel Cinematic Universe or something. It's just complete fantasy, but he believed it, and so the whole day I just thought about that. Like, why would somebody believe something like that, And as a historian, I even did a social media post, like trying to figure out this person's perspective. And I really came to the conclusion that, for a lot of people, it's easier to believe something so outlandish as that rather than believe our own really complicated history. Our history hurts. So what do we do to counteract something like that? I mean, to talk to these people, to bring them back into the fold so that they don't believe that Tartarians lived here 200 years ago.
That is a tough question. I've never heard of that kind of mythos, but I grew up in a culture where a lot of people would tell you things and you think, oh my gosh, I just don't think that's, I think of when I grew up, you would hear this thing about chariots of the gods. And years later, I read a couple of those books and they're like, this guy, what was his name? He was very popular, best-selling author. And the idea was that basically people in Latin America couldn't have built these civilizations, that they were built by aliens from outer space, right? And so, yeah, I think these beliefs just go deep in this culture. We were talking earlier before we opened the public part. I just think we need to look more into the culture here and try to figure out why we have these perennial myths or stories that come up. I'd say to counter it, we need to come up with our own stories about where we actually do come from. And I think that story, to me, and I've heard a similar kind of story from different people in different times in this country. And part of that, I think, comes from a sense of too often we're alienated. I hate to use the word alien because in a sense we're talking about aliens from outer space. But I think and again, I'm thinking out loud here. I don't have any answers, obviously, but I think part of the problems in our culture now, especially in how we just have not dealt with the global pandemic successfully, we haven't figured out how to end these terrible wars. No one is like these wars, since early on, but we just can't. They kind of go on and on. But part of it is that we are, and this gets back to Richard Rodriguez's the points he tries to make. And as much as his work challenges us in many ways, he does have a point about rootlessness. And if I understand him correctly, one of the things he's saying is that too often we allow ourselves to lose touch with our histories. And we try to say that, oh, we're all the same, we're all, whatever, but without understanding kind of where we do come from. One of the things I've noticed in recent years is that I get contacted by different groups. One of the groups contacted me recently is an Italian American organization somewhere in Queens. I'm not even familiar with the neighborhoods, but they're saying that they're encouraging what they call their people learn Italian. And what they're saying is we never should have let go of our people's history. That is, we know what country we're in now. We're in New York. New York is obviously its own country in many ways, right? New York City, the Queens, especially, a beautiful place. But we are trying to recapture our own origin stories. And that might be a way of dealing with this issue of conspiracy theories, because I think conspiracy theories in many ways come from a culture where people just feel so alienated from themselves and each other, and the isolation that's just so profound, in this culture. So I don't know if that answers that question, Garrett, but yeah. When I grew up, it was people, they would talk about I actually had an uncle who would say, well, have you ever daydreamed and you feel like you've lost a few minutes? And if you made the mistake of saying, oh yeah, that's happened to me, you'd say, well, you were abducted by aliens. It's like, oh no.
Well, Stuart, I saw you had your little hand raised. Did you want to make a comment or ask a question?
Well, it's probably going to take longer than the time we have left, but it was a wonderful lecture. There's so much richness in it and so many things to comment on. I really like some of the questions that you raised. If we did have a minute or two, you hit on, this is a small part of the vast array of wonderful things that you've said. You did talk about or did ask the question about how people raise their children to deal with just oppression and what they did in segregation. And of course, I have stories from my parents and grandparents, and everyone knows about the talk, right? Everybody in the room knows about what the quote unquote the talk is. But I was curious about if there were parallels in the Latinx community, or if they've been studied about similar types of things, what were the similar, perhaps on some issues that were unique, right? What is the equivalent of the talk? And just one more point about the chariot of the gods, that's a long myth. I think that you absolutely hit it on the nose. It's much easier to believe in Atlantis or sunken cultures than it is that Black and brown people could have been that brilliant. But I was just curious. I wanted to ask that question about the Latinx equivalent of the talk.
Yes, and there is. And I'm so glad you mentioned that. So there's a really cool kind of sociological literature. A lot of Latino female scholars have talked about this. And so if you email me, I can give you some citations, but there is the parallel in our communities. Growing up, I never lived in a community which was like majority Chicano, and we were always kind of minorities. And I'm thinking now, Bremerton, Washington, So my father was very conservative, well, it's funny, he goes back and forth, but I'm pretty sure he voted for Ronald Reagan twice. And but as a kid, and I was born in 1964, the first thing he taught us as young boys was never talk to the police. If you see the police, you go the other way. You don't trust them. All they can do is bad things. And so interesting, this very in many ways conservative, retired military person gave us a version of the talk which, fathers and mothers of his generation gave to everyone. And it was, I don't want to make anyone feel bad. But one of the things that they taught us, our elders did, was, look, just stay away from white people because they're very angry right now. This was situational. Now, the 70s, you have to remember, when I was a kid in the 70s, this was the backlash era, especially on the West Coast. And when we would walk to school as kids, I was actually, after my mom's first divorce, we were living in a town called San Leandro, California, in the East Bay. We would walk from Marina Boulevard, the very few Black and Mexican kids, there's like 5 of us, would almost be holding hands, walk from Marina Boulevard to Garfield Elementary, around the corner, about a mile. White adults would stop in cars and yell at us, and even sometimes throw beer cans at us. And they would say, go home to where you belong, go back home. And as 4th graders, we're like, you take everything literally. And we're like, well, we can't go home. We just came there, man. We'll get in trouble. Later years, we realized they're talking about going home to Mexico or to Africa, wherever they thought our homes were, right? And so, yeah, we had those talks just constantly. And, but a lot of it had to do with, especially the police. Stay away from the police. And I'm not a scholar of this, but I can almost guarantee you that that's the origins of the DARE program out of LA in the early 80s, was this idea that, well, we've lost the parents. We're going to have to if we put the police in the schools, maybe we get the kids to trust the police, so I don't know.
Wow. I feel like we could go on for hours and hours. Thank you so much, Stuart, for that question. Yeah.
Is that a Austin Community College shirt you got on?
Oh, yes, I forgot to share with you. I have Austin Community College shirt. Yeah. Thank you for sending it to me. Yeah.
I'm glad you're sporting it.
Shoot, I almost forgot to mention it.
Awesome.
Yeah, I love the shirt. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Muchísimas gracias, Dr. Ortiz. This has been a fantastic kickoff. I hope we get to stay in touch. And Dr. Colesreport sends her apologies. She had to run off to get to class, but she also expressed that this has just been absolutely wonderful. So thank you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Let's stay connected. And
Yes.
Thank you to everyone who took time out of your day, out of your evening to attend this kickoff. And I'll drop the link in the chat once again for the other events in our series. We hope to see you next Wednesday at noon for our Miércoles de Músicas. And I hope everyone has a wonderful evening. Thank you all again. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you again. Bye now.
Bye. Take care.